Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 27th episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the Great and try to get past the honorific and understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. I'm grateful that you are here. If you're up for it, and you haven't yet, then could you take a moment and rate the show on whatever service you're using to listen in? Thank you, thank you, thank you. Now, last time, we said farewell to Mithridates VI Eupator, who went toe-to-toe with Rome for 20 years before being betrayed by his son, committing suicide, and leaving his shattered kingdom to its fates. Don't feel too bad for the guy over his son's betrayal. In his long and eventful reign, he definitely murdered plenty of his own family, so it was a little bit of the shoe on the other foot scenario here. Besides his own domestic difficulties over the course of that career, Mithridates tussled with some of the titans of Roman history, including Sulla, Lucullus, and Pompey. It was the last of these three who finished off the Pontic king, ended the Mithridatic Wars, and added to his soaring reputation as Rome's greatest general and leading citizen. Now, one thing I haven't done much in this series is remind you, dear listener, that in addition to being an independent and decidedly uncommercial podcaster, I'm also an author. I have written 3 books about Roman history: Evil Roman Emperors, The History of Roman 12 Buildings, and The Leadership Genius of Julius Caesar. If you are enjoying this series, then you may like any of these titles. Now, I say this in part to shamelessly hawk my own books, but also to say that this is a subject that I love, and Pompey is a central character in the grand narrative that is Roman history. We're going to be here for a while. Roman country, let's ride. Like so many conquering adventurers, Pompey consciously imitated Alexander the Great wherever he could. Just as Alexander had given a dignified burial of Darius III, even after chasing the Persian king to all ends of the earth and shattering the Achaemenid Persian Empire, so too did Pompey inter Mithridates with the pomp and ceremony due a great king and a worthy adversary. Pompey showed great respect for his vanquished foe, demonstrating his own magnanimity and making himself look better by honoring the worth of his foe. As we heard last time, Pompey took from the dead king Alexander's cloak, which Mithridates had worn to cement his connection to the legendary conqueror. Now Pompey had it, and his star grew ever so brighter. In fact, by the time he was marching east to confront Mithridates, Pompey had reached such lofty heights that he already carried with him the name Magnus, or the Great. This makes Pompey a unique character in this series. So far as I can tell, of all the people that we have covered, Pompey was the only one to be called the Great in his lifetime. And we even know who gave him this name, Sulla, and a likely reason why, to take a little dig at the upstart for his boundless ambition and thirst for glory. Now, of course, we've met Sulla before, as his story and that of Mithridates were often intertwined. We're going to get to know him a lot here, too, because he's both deeply relevant to the story of Pompey and one of the most controversial figures in all of Roman history. By calling Pompey Magnus, Sulla, it seems, was taking a shot at his subordinate's air of self-importance in order to knock him down a peg or two. But Pompey, ever the great self-promoter, saw the opportunity it presented, took the name, no matter how it was intended, and ran with it. In time, he certainly made a case that he deserved it, without irony, that is. In a history steeped with legendary and mythic heroes, Pompey's defeat of Mithridates put him near the top of the Roman all-time great list, and he was just getting started. So yes, Pompey is a towering figure in Roman history. To understand his life and career, and to get a handle on whether he is worthy of the name the Great, we have to do what we've done so often in this series: dial the clock back a bit and set some context. We've been inching ever closer to Roman as this series has progressed, but now is the time to take a closer look. Who were the Romans? What made them tick? Why did they seem so bent on conquering everyone and everything? Before we start our review of Rome's founding and rise, a few words of qualification. Roman history is a story well and often told. Unlike some of the people and civilizations we've discussed before, we know a lot of Roman history. Some of this is legendary. Much of it is an interpretation of events and people, but there is a rich and deep narrative history of Rome. This matters to us because, as always, I want to avoid getting too far off track. This is a history of Pompey the Great, not Rome per se. So we'll try to focus on the details that are important for setting context for him and for his career, such as the social stratification of Roman society and the traditional role of the Senate. if you're a fan of Roman history, then you'll notice some important people and events being skipped over. It's not that, say, Camillus isn't important to Rome. He is. It's just that he's not necessarily important in the story of Pompey. In other words, I'm not going to try to recreate other podcast series that have already done a brilliant job of covering the history of Rome. Still, even as we try to get to and explore the life of Pompey Magnus as quickly as we can, I should let everyone know up front that this series is going to be a multi-part treatment, and this episode is more about the prologue story of Rome than it is directly about Pompey. But Rome is fun, so let's have some fun, shall we? So with that out of the way, here's my attempt to go from the founding of Rome up to the entrance of Pompey the Great onto the world stage as quickly as I am capable of doing. Legends state that the twin brothers Romulus and Remus were born to a Vestal virgin, a priestess of the god of hearth and home, Vesta. Their mother, Rhea Silvia, had been visited by Mars, the god of both war and agriculture. She also happened to be the daughter of the king of Alba Longa, a city in the central Italian region of Latium. Her father, King Numitor, had been overthrown by his grasping and scheming brother, Amulius. The usurper saw the twin babies as a threat, both as the grandsons of the rightful king and the sons of a god, and he ordered them to be killed. Unable to murder her own sons, the distraught Rhea Silvia instead placed them in a basket and set it upon the river Tiber. If this sounds familiar, it's because the abandoned baby in a basket story is a common one in the ancient world. In fact, you may remember the first great from the very first episode of this series, Sargon, was legendarily so set adrift. In fact, you may also remember that one of Sargon's sons was named Remus, which sounds a lot like Remus. By the way, you should go back and listen to the Sargon episode. It's great. Anyway, the twin brothers were abandoned, left to die from exposure by their heartbroken mother. But fate, it would seem, had other plans. The twin boys were found by a she-wolf, who took them back to her cave and suckled them. The wolf nursed the young boys to health and kept them safe and sound until they were discovered by a local shepherd, who raised the boys as his own sons. But while they grew up as shepherds, the true nature of the boys just rose to the surface. They were the grandsons of a king, and they demonstrated strong character and leadership capabilities. They were not fated to live the quiet pastoral life, and their energy and charisma pulled them toward a life of adventure. Eventually, they learned their true origins as descendants of the wrongfully exiled Numitor. They led the ouster of Amulius, and they reinstalled their grandfather on the throne. Emboldened by their successes, and with the blessings of their grateful grandfather, the brothers struck out on their own, intent on founding their own kingdom. They came to a gentle bend in the Tiber and decided that they were in the right spot. Several hills rose from the riverbanks, offering strong defensive positions to would-be settlers. But which hill should they choose? Romulus wanted to found the city on the Palatine Hill. Remus insisted on the Aventine. The dispute turned acrimonious, and the brothers and their respective followers fell into conflict. Romulus murdered his brother in the ensuing fight. The Palatine it was. On April 21st, 753 BCE, Romulus established his new city and named it in his honor. Thus Rome was founded by the scion of kings, a boy reared by a wolf and covered in the blood of his own brother. This definitely set the tone for what was to come. It's important to stress that this is all legend, right down to the comically specific date, which was calculated by a well-meaning Roman noble hundreds of years later. In fact, archaeological evidence suggests that people have been living on and around the Palatine for much longer. The roots of Roman history run deeper than even the Roman chronicles. But the mythical nature of this founding legend mattered little. It was how the Romans constructed their self-image. This is how they saw themselves, founded in blood. Besides, if Romulus could personally slay Remus, then anyone should be on notice. Violence, fratricide, was all in the founding DNA of the city that would come to rule the known world. So too was rationalization of violence. In terms of shady behavior, at the core of a founding ethos, we are just getting started. In this city, the end always justified the means. Once up and running, Romulus needed to populate his new establishment. He'd founded the city with a group of followers. These people and their descendants took pride of place in Roman society as the elites, called patricians. This class claimed a special spot for themselves in society. With himself as king, Romulus organized the leading men from among his founders into an advisory body called the Senate. Anyone not of patrician rank, not from a family who was present at the founding of Rome, was a plebeian. That's one without noble status. Romulus needed people to help him build and develop his petty kingdom. To augment the group of retainers he'd had in tow when he established the city, he began attracting all sorts of the worst elements, criminals, outcasts from other cities, often violent brigands. He made it a point to take in anyone. They built and fortified and planned and did everything they needed to get Rome up and running. Well, almost everything. It was hard to establish a viable city if it was only populated by men of questionable character. An all-male population wasn't exactly going to last several generations. To solve this issue, Romulus threw a party. He invited neighboring tribes to join a festival in honor of the sea god Neptune. He got everyone good and drunk, then, when he was ready, he gave the signal. His men rushed in, overpowered the men from the Sabine tribe, and kidnapped and ran off with their women. This incident, known to history as the Rape of the Sabine Women, might have infused Rome with a little gender diversity, but it did not exactly go over well with the Sabines. The Sabines responded to the wholesale kidnapping of their women by forming alliances with other outraged tribes, and the coalition began a war with Rome. Justified though they may have been, the war went badly for the anti-Roman coalition, and the Romans killed foreign kings and commanders. Thus, within a short time of its founding, Rome was already at war, besting regional rivals and expanding its power base. In time, the Romans and Sabines fought a bitter battle in Rome itself. By this time, enough time had passed that the women themselves were deeply conflicted. And perhaps a precursor of Stockholm Syndrome, the captive women now had husbands and children, and they were happy, or at least resigned to, their personal situations. Just before the final showdown, which would have led to the deaths of the husbands, brothers, and fathers, the Sabine women rushed in, stood between the two armies, and begged them to stop the fighting. Impressed by their courage, both sides agreed to lay down their arms, and instead of fighting, they committed to mutual support for one another. The Sabines were welcomed into Rome, and the two tribes combined forces. Romulus agreed to a power-sharing agreement with the Sabine king, and the two sides solved the thorny dilemma by merging. Rome's founding legend is twisted indeed. In time, Romulus either died a natural death, or was murdered by the Senate, or ascended to the heavens in a divine miracle. No matter what, even the mythical Romulus was mortal, or at least not permanently of this earth, and his successor king took his place. But while Romulus was militaristic and ruthless, his successor, Numa Pompilius, was focused on peace, justice, and religion. He established priesthoods and law codes and generally opted for diplomacy through words, not spears and swords. His successors would resume Rome's martial aggression. The kingship passed from one to the next for a few hundred years. All the while, Rome projected its power outward. Of course, and as already stated, the founding legends of Rome are the stuff of myth, and it's impossible to know what really happened. But what is noteworthy is that what the Romans told themselves about their own origins and how these myths reflected the ethos of the Roman world. Murder, betrayal, kidnapping, warfare, and all sorts of devious behavior were all celebrated in the founding mythology of the Roman state. As the history progressed, and we move from myth to historicity, these same patterns will emerge time and again. And while the founding characters are likely either wholesale inventions or deep embellishments, there's no doubt that the city was growing, projecting power, and becoming more worrisome for its neighbors. By the late 500s BCE, a truly awful guy was on the throne, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, as the seventh and final king of Rome. Before you ask, Superbus meant the proud, as in arrogant and haughty, not superb. He was a jerk, tyrannical, and violent. To make matters worse, so was his family, including his wife, the daughter of a good and just king. The two teamed up to murder Dad and take the throne for themselves. Resentment against Tarquin grew, but the people lived in fear of his violent reprisals. But when his son raped a virtuous noblewoman, the people had enough. The son, Sextus, had lusted after a noblewoman named Lucretia. She had refused his advances, but Sextus was undeterred. He told Lucretia that if she did not sleep with him, then he would kill her and tell the world that he had caught her in bed with a slave, which, according to Roman law, would have justified the killing. Not wanting her husband to suffer the humiliation of thinking that his virtuous wife had been unfaithful, she submitted. His lust slaked, Sextus skulked off into the night. Lucretia called for her husband and her father. she revealed the horrors of the situation to both. To save him from any suggestion that she had been unfaithful and to restore her own honor, she drew a dagger and stabbed herself to death. Her husband was distraught, as was his friend and companion, Lucius Junius Brutus. Brutus, holding the bloody knife with which poor Lucretia had moments ago killed herself, vowed revenge. Together, they resolved to lead the people in an uprising to topple the tyrannical Tarquins. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it's because in about 5 centuries, a descendant of this Brutus will gain eternal notoriety for his betrayal of Julius Caesar. But this particular Brutus led the Romans in revolt and ousted the tyrant king and his family. Tarquin would spend the rest of his days trying to reclaim his throne, but Rome was never to have a king again. Well, not technically. Not to be too much of a buzzkill, but there is no confirmed evidence of any of the 7 kings of Rome, and it's likely that most, if not all, of their stories are moral inventions used to provide foundational myths for Roman institutions, culture, and society. Rome likely had kings, and some were likely better than others. Some of the myths may even have had an echo of truth, but the Romans sure believed in this history, or at least relied on it to help them define themselves. In 509 BCE, in place of the monarchy, the Romans instituted the Republic, a quasi-democratic form of government that allowed limited voting rights and qualifications for office. This date is also suspect, as it comes 1 year before the establishment of Athenian democracy. It seems likely that a patriotic Roman made sure that the date reflected the establishment of the Republic to just slightly edge out those arrogant Athenians for the invention of representative government. Regardless of when this happened, it's clear that the Senate now rose to prominence in Roman society. This body, the one that had been formed as the advisory body to the king, was now at the top of the pecking order in Rome, which resembled an oligarchy more than a proto-democracy. Roman society was top-heavy, with a narrow band of wealthy patricians controlling the state, making all the decisions, appropriating most of the wealth, and having an exclusive lock on elected offices. The Roman constitution was exceedingly complex. It was never codified in writing. Like almost every constitution in Roman history, the Roman system was an overlapping amalgamation of traditions, evolving social structures, adaptations to shifting circumstances, and violent upheavals in times of political or military crisis. It's way too complicated to get into it now, so a quick overview will have to suffice. Obsessed with making sure no one would ever subject Rome to their tyrannical whims, as had Tarquin the Proud, the core of the Roman Republic was a carefully constructed series of offices with shared power and distributed responsibilities. This was most notable in the elected magistracies, which decreased in number as they increased in rank. The most prominent annual office was the consul, akin to a president of the system. To ensure that no one person held sole control of the day-to-day government, 2 consuls were elected annually, and to be consul was to attain one of the highest levels of social prestige in Rome. However, in times of extreme crisis, the Senate could appoint one man as sole control, exempt from normal checks on power, to serve for 6 months, though, generally, these individuals laid down their powers upon successful resolution of the crisis that necessitated their office in the first place. This office was called dictator. The Romans also elected a pair of officials called censors every 5 years, who then served for a term of 18 months. Among other responsibilities, the censors conducted the count of the population, thus, census, reviewed the roles of the Senate to ensure property qualifications, and regulated the morality of Rome. Another important social dynamic in ancient Rome was the growing discord between the elite patricians and the lower status plebeians. Not long after the Republic had been established, the plebeians looked around and wondered why they weren't permitted to stand for office, or enjoy some of the trappings of high society. In or around 494 BCE, the plebeians marched out of Rome and encamped on a hill outside the city. The succession of the plebs, as this event is known, ranks among the first labor strikes in human history, and it was the first in a series of social breakdowns known as the conflict of the orders. In time, the plebeians won for themselves a broader set of rights, including access to elected office, protection from usurious lenders, the ability to intermarry with patricians, and the creation of powerful new magistracies and popular assemblies to further their representation in the apparatus of state. Around 450 BCE, the plebeians also pushed for and attained the codification of Roman law into a cohesive legal code. In part, this was to prevent rich oligarchs from abusing the rank-and-file citizens on a whim, but it was also a necessary development for a rapidly evolving and growing society. The 12 tables, named for the bronze tablets on which they were inscribed, were Rome's first formal legal code. And while it did help ease tensions between the social orders somewhat, Rome remained a deeply class-conscious and socially segregated society. This, as with the traditional role of the Senate in Roman life, will loom large in the story of Pompey. With some semblance of representation for plebeians and the rudiments of their constitution established, Rome began to throw its weight around. By the early 300s BCE, Rome had exerted its influence over its fellow Latin cities and overwhelmed the neighboring Etruscans. These conquests did more than expand territory. They brought about cultural exchange, which gave Rome, among other things, new religious and architectural traditions. In addition, when Rome successfully dominated a foreign foe, part of the terms of peace included requirements for the vanquished enemy to contribute soldiers to Rome's ongoing string of entanglements. As Roman power oozed out in every direction, they built a complicated series of interdependencies and affiliations across the Latin peninsula. This gave them almost inexhaustible resources from which to draw, and their ambitions grew in step with their power. By the time of their epic knockdown, drag-out fights with Carthage, historian Adrian Goldsworthy estimates that Rome could field as many as 700,000 soldiers. So when they got wiped out in the thousands, or tens of thousands, such as has happened at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, they tended to dust themselves off, raise a new army, and just keep fighting. Their stunned adversaries wondered why they didn't ever seem to know they'd been beaten. The Romans just kept coming, sending army after army, no matter how many it took, until they won. This contest with Carthage, the other great power of the ancient Mediterranean world, and known as the Second Punic War, did much to define Roman destiny. At the beginning of the conflict, the two powers were roughly equal, vying for lucrative trade networks and colonial possessions. By the end, Carthage was shattered, its brilliant general Hannibal exiled, and Rome the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. This fight accelerated the process of Rome's aggressive acquisition of overseas territory. The islands of Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia were now firmly in Rome's control. Rome was a republic in terms of government, but was beginning to put together something that felt a bit like an empire. I guess you could say things were getting pretty serious. One of the catalyzing forces that powered the dynamo of Rome was the competition between its leading people for status and fame. Not content to fight for recognition through elected office, ambitious Romans wanted to add to their glory and to push the exalted status of their families to new heights through martial accomplishments that added territory, subdued enemies, and conquered foreign foes. So much of what drove Rome's relentless expansion was the ego, and the thirst for honors and accolades was insatiable. The Romans developed many different kinds of awards for martial valor. The highest battlefield recognition was the grass crown, given to an officer or commander whose actions single-handedly saved an entire legion. The second highest award was the civic crown, made from oak leaves. It was given to a soldier who saved the life of a fellow citizen. Others included the gold crown, awarded to a soldier who slay an enemy in single combat and held his ground until the end of battle, the mural crown for the first soldier over the walls of an enemy city, and the naval crown, given to the first soldier to board an enemy ship in a naval encounter. Of course, to go hand in hand with their elaborate system of honors, the Romans devised all sorts of punishments for cowardice and failure in battle. Unfortunate soldiers could be subject to whipping, public humiliation, being forced to eat barley instead of wheat, barley being the fodder for pack animals, loss of rank, or even, in extreme cases, execution. The worst fate that could befall a Roman military unit was to be condemned to decimation. Today, we think of decimation as a catch-all term for being wiped out, but to the Romans, decimation meant something far more sinister. It was an extreme form of punishment, issued by a furious commander, reserved for the most extreme examples of cowardice, disobedience, or mutiny. When a unit was subject to decimation, a cohort of troops, usually just shy of about 500 soldiers, was divided into groups of 10. These groups then drew lots. The unfortunate soldier who drew the short straw in each group was then executed at the hands of the other 9, either by stoning or being beaten to death. Decimation was extremely rare, but the threat of it struck fear in the hearts of legionaries. These survivors, the ones that had to execute their comrades, lived out their lives under a shadow of shame and humiliation. For the ambitious Roman commander, the crowning glory, the moment all strove for, was the triumph. This was a parade granted by the senatorial degree in recognition of a commander who successfully defeated a foreign foe in war or battle. The celebratory parade was the pinnacle of a career and spilled over into a massive public festival across the city. For centuries, Roman generals fought abroad in the hopes of being awarded the right to celebrate a triumph. On the big day, the winning general wore a gold-embroidered purple toga. His face was painted blood red in honor of the chief Roman god, Jupiter. For just a day, the general could look semi-divine and, well, kingly. After the overthrow of the monarchy, the Romans detested even the hint of kingship. To have such aspirations could be a death sentence, but when a Roman general triumphed, everyone indulged in the overwrought celebration of the returning hero, king for a day, but not a day more. The Romans were paradoxically in awe of individual power and repulsed by it, so in order to keep the conquering hero grounded, a slave would ride along in the general's chariot and whisper in his ear a warning, "Remember, thou art but a man." In other words, don't get any ideas. Part of the triumphal regalia was a laurel wreath. Depictions of this iconic wreath have come to be one of the most ubiquitous symbols of strength, accomplishment, and victory. Most people have seen the image of the laurel wreath countless times. In this crown lies the origins of the expression, "Don't rest on your laurels," cautioning generals not to over-rely on their military conquest or the adulation of the people. On the day of the triumph, the general would line up his parade outside the sacred boundary of the city called the Pomerium. This was the only time soldiers were permitted to march inside city lines, and the parade would duly wind itself across the boundary and into the city. Throngs of people would pour out into the streets, waving laurel sprigs and anxiously waving to cheer the glorious accomplishments of the mighty Romans. As the parade grew closer to the center of the city, the crowds grew larger and larger, reaching a fever pitch as the procession neared the Forum. The general's chariot would be the focal point in a parade that included displays of the acts of the heroism of the commander, spoils of war, and when possible, captured and vanquished enemies marching in chains. For the hero, the greater the victory, the greater the show. The culmination of the triumph was entering the Forum by the Via Sacra, the sacred way. If you visit the Forum in Rome today, you are walking along this very special ancient road. The final act was for the general to make his way through the adoring crowds and to the temple of Jupiter. As the awe crowd watched, the general would ascend the steps and offer sacrifices to the chief god of the Roman pantheon. After the sacrifices, the public would join in feasting, paid for by the largesse of the victorious general, eating and drinking themselves silly. Games and theater performances were also staged across the city. The party could last for days. Triumphs were exceedingly rare. Rome's conquests came in fits and starts, stretched through the centuries. A citizen might go a lifetime without seeing one. When they happened, it was a big freaking deal. By the way, that description of a triumph is from my book, The History of Rome in 12 Buildings. So yeah, I plagiarized, but I plagiarized myself. Let's summarize a bit here. Rome was founded as a monarchy, but within a few hundred years decidedly tilted toward oligarchy. Their society was extremely class-conscious and deeply suspicious of any one person who held too much power or sway. At the same time, the elites of Roman society and the ambitious people who aspired to become elite desperately competed with one another for status and glory, both for their own standing and to augment that of their legacy and their families. Those at the top of the social order looked down on those that tried to join the club. Most of the people at the top of Roman social order were constantly striving to increase their wealth and privilege, and considerable number were willing to undercut political rivals in order to do so. When you come to think of it, this doesn't sound all too dissimilar to what we see around us today. By the close of the 2nd century BCE, the Roman Republic had been around, allegedly, for about 4 centuries, but it was in trouble. Class conflict and political controversy gripped Rome, and spasms of violence left thousands of partisans dead, with the plebeians suffering the brunt force of the violence, often being murdered by patrician gangs in the hundreds or thousands. Unlike the fall of the monarchy, which was fairly swift and definitive, the destruction of the republic was drawn out over a century, with factions vying for power, populists fighting for reforms, conservatives protecting their order, and new entrants entering and exiting the political stage with dizzying frequency. They had plenty to keep themselves busy if they were just looking after their own affairs, but Rome was Rome, and all this upheaval happened among the backdrop of foreign wars and overseas colonization. For example, the Romans viciously ended the Punic Wars in 146 BCE when Scipio Aemilianus ended the Third Punic War by razing Carthage, and Lucius Mummius obliterated Corinth. Rome subjugated Greece and Macedonia, and as we saw in our Mithridates episodes, began spreading across Asia Minor, either influencing or outright controlling kingdoms and territories. The Romans were constantly fighting either themselves or foreign foes, or more often than not, both at the same time. To put this in stark light, one of the gods of the Roman pantheon was Janus. He had two faces, one that looked forward and one that looked backward. It's from him that we get the name of the month January, as it looks back over the prior year and forward to the year to come. In Rome, the doors of the Temple of Janus were closed in times of peace and opened in times of war. Allegedly, these doors were closed after the temple was established by the second king of Rome, but opened shortly thereafter as Rome fell into war with its neighbors. The doors stayed open for about a half a millennia, when they were briefly closed for a few days in 235 BCE after the conclusion of the First Punic War. But Rome quickly got itself embroiled in yet another conflict, and the doors were reopened, and they stayed that way for more than 200 years. Thus, for about 7 centuries, Rome considered itself in a state of near perpetual warfare, except for a few days in the 200s BCE. Even when Rome was tearing itself to shreds, internal political chaos, it managed to fight foreign wars. They fought everywhere, all at once. All of these cycles of violence, both foreign and domestic, tended to create opportunity for the ambitious and opportunistic. At the same time, endless conflicts had a way of wiping out generations of the nobility. In the Republican period, the Romans had no conception of specialized military versus political leadership. The leading men of Rome were expected to orate and argue cases in the forum and don armor and command a legion with equal skill, and with a whole horde of the next generation of grasping nobles as his subordinate. So when Rome went headlong into conflict, and that conflict went badly, then Rome could find itself facing a serious leadership shortage. Such was the case in 216 BCE when the Carthaginian general Hannibal obliterated a Roman army and wiped out between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans in one horrific day at the Battle of Cannae. By the time the Republic began shaking itself apart at the late 2nd century BCE, enough cracks in the rigid social structure began to appear that a few provincials, or people born outside the patrician order, began to bubble their way up into positions of leadership, even if such things came with scorn and contempt from ancient families. These people, called novus homo, or new men, established themselves as important members of the Roman society, but often served as a flashpoint of political acrimony. By far, by an order of magnitude, the most important novus homo of the Republican period was Gaius Marius. We briefly introduced Marius in our last episode on Mithridates, but did so by calling him an aged general. He is an utterly fascinating figure. Born neither in Rome nor into the elite tiers of society, Marius took a long time to get his career on track. He kept at it, and once his career found its footing, he rose through the ranks by developing an almost delusional sense of his own destiny, a willingness to advance himself through his political patrons, then toss those same patrons aside when it served his interests, and an undeniable talent for leadership, strategy, and logistics. He took a step up to his social status by marrying a noble woman from a distinguished family that many people thought had its best days behind it. His wife, Julia, hailed from the Julii Caesares, and if that sounds familiar, well, it's because in time, her nephew, who we will now call Julius Caesar, would become, well, Julius Caesar. Marius had a knack for solving problems that stymied everyone else. In 107 BCE, he got himself elected consul, in large part by trashing the noble senator that had given Marius a shot at important military posting, and then taking that noble's job. In short order, and in no small part because of the initiative of a young subordinate who seized the Numidian king Jugurtha, Marius ended a war in North Africa that had been festering sore for Rome for some time. He was lauded as a hero, but that young subordinate chafed when Marius got all the glory. Marius had been elected consul, but, and I sort of glossed over this a little bit, there was a whole range of elected offices. Roman law prohibited anyone from serving in the same elected office for 10 years. Tradition also dictated that to stand for the consulship, the candidate must be 42 years old. The latter was never a problem where Marius was concerned, given how late he'd gotten start, moving up through the ranks. But in the waning years of the 2nd century BCE, a crisis flared up and Rome needed a hero. Marius, having solved the Jugurthine War, was seen as the only man for the job, and beginning in 105 BCE, he was elected consul every year for the next 5 years. Traditions and constitution be damned. The crisis facing Rome was a series of migrating German and Celtic tribes who slashed their way into and out of Roman territory time and again. All the Roman armies that had been sent to put a halt to their marauding were obliterated, and it fell to Marius to deal with the existential threat. He reorganized the Roman military, overhauled their weaponry, and drilled and drilled and drilled his troops until they were good and ready. And only then did he march them to the north to confront the dreaded tribes. He smashed them to pieces, ended the threat to Rome, and cemented his legacy as one of the greatest Romans in already long history. If only he had stopped there. With that ominous foreshadowing out of the way, I want to go back to something I said at the start of this episode. This is an extremely complex time in Roman history, and we have more sources about it than anything we've covered so far. I'm trying to introduce people and themes that are important to set the stage for our featured guest of this episode, Pompey, but not necessarily tell the entirety of Roman history. Not counting the introduction or any of the bonus episodes, this is the 27th episode in this series. We could easily write 27 episodes about Rome from 133 BCE to 121 BCE alone. I want to stress that I'm not trying to claim that this is a history of Rome, so as I suspect that listeners might be more familiar with this subject than some of the other things discussed, please remember this is about Pompey, not Rome. Okay, with this pause for hand-wringing and equivocation out of the way, by the 1st century BCE, Marius had risen to be the greatest Roman in anyone's lifetime, even as he dispensed with laws and traditions meant to be a check on anyone's power. But he had soaked up so much of the attention, garnered so much of the laurels, that there was a whole generation of nobles anxious for their time in the sun. One of these was the key deputy of Marius, the same guy that had captured the enemy king Jugurtha. This was Lucius Cornelius Sulla. We have met Sulla in the Mithridates episodes. He was the guy that squared off with the Pontic king and bested him in the First Mithridatic War. You may recall that Sulla hastily concluded a peace treaty with Mithridates to return home and deal with some domestic troubles. Before this seesawing, Sulla had been the center of another crisis, the Social War. I don't know about you, but when I first heard the term the Social War, I thought it sounded kind of fun. Delightfully paradoxical, a bunch of witty sophisticates exchanging passive-aggressive barbs at a cocktail party. It was anything but. This conflict, which erupted in 91 BCE, unleashed a spasm of confused, bloody violence that roiled the Italian peninsula for several chaotic and bloody years. At issue was the relationship between Rome and the allied cities, called sociale, across Italy. These were communities that chafed under Roman hegemony and either wanted to be treated as equals with full rights of Roman citizenship or to be left alone. Rome had kept these allies at arm's length, levying troops and encroaching on territory, but not offering the full protection of voting rights. Some prominent Roman politicians were in favor of extending the franchise to the sociale, a highly controversial political issue. The leading champion of enfranchisement was a nobleman serving in the office of the tribune of the plebs, named Marcus Livius Drusus. Drusus pursued several reforms, which was always dangerous in the highly conservative Roman world. In 91 BCE, Drusus was stabbed from behind by an unseen assailant, screamed out in pain, and promptly died. The culprit was never identified. To this day, no one knows who killed Drusus or why. Furious at the loss of their champion, and finally clued in that Rome was never going to treat them as equals, the sociale took to arms to gain by force what they hadn't gained through politics and diplomacy. The social war is important to our particular area of focus because it was during this conflict that several important Romans emerged from the shadows and entered the stage. But it's also a confused mess. 3 years of spasmodic violence, armies careening around Italy, shifting alliances, violent suppression. Chaos can create opportunities for ambitious people. One nobleman who'd been working his way up through the ranks was Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo, a grasping and ruthless nobleman from the region of Picenum, northeast of Rome. Strabo meant cross-eyed, by the way, and the cognomen is helpful in differentiating from his famous, one could say, great son, Pompey. While not from Rome, Pompey Strabo was from an ennobled family, enormously wealthy, and if lacking certain personality refinements, was nonetheless an organized and competent military strategist. At the outbreak of the Social War, Pompey Strabo had been on his progression through the Roman system of career advancement called the cursus honorum, or course of honors, by which Romans pursued increasingly prestigious roles and offices, the culmination of which was the consulship. Each rung on the ladder brought more power and influence, and competition for office grew increasingly fierce at every turn. The Social War was a boon to Pompey Strabo's career. At its outbreak, he personally raised an army of several regions from his native Picenum, equipped and drilled them, and marched them into the fray. He won several major engagements and proved to be one of the most successful commanders fighting for the Roman Republic. Except, he didn't really seem to be fighting for the Republic per se. Pompey Strabo seemed to be fighting mostly for himself. Don't get me wrong, he was a huge part of the Roman Republic's ultimate victory in the Social War, at one point crushing an enemy army allegedly 60,000 soldiers strong. But he wasn't an ideologue. He wasn't fighting in service of a higher calling or sense of duty or strong Republican principles. He fought because winning on the battlefield was the best way to cloak yourself in honors and glory, and in his case, riches. After he sacked the city of Asculum, Strabo tortured and executed the city's leaders, then auctioned off the riches of the falling. Rather than share these spoils with his troops or use them to bolster the war chest of the Republic, Strabo kept it all for himself. This was both unorthodox and deeply unpopular with his troops, as plunder was one of the prime incentives for any troop to serve in the military. While his reputation might have soured with his own men, he surged in popularity with the larger Roman world. While the fighting was raging on, Strabo stood for and won the consulship in 89 BCE. During his term of office, Strabo's consular colleague was killed in the fighting, and for a brief time he was the sole consul of the Roman Republic. He may have tried to pull a Marius and seek a second consecutive consulship in 88 BCE, but such machinations amounted to nothing because, by then, two things had come to pass. The first was that the social war was winding down. The Republican forces tend to come out on top in most of the decisive battles. At the same time, the Republic shrewdly offered the prized status of citizenship for the communities that laid down their arms. Some did and gained the citizenship that they'd been fighting for, while simultaneously weakening the forces of those that held out. The second development was the decisive arrival on center stage of someone who easily eclipsed Strabo for fame and prestige, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Yep, this Sulla was the same guy who went toe-to-toe with our friend Mithridates in the First Mithridatic War, who chastised Roman magistrates for the instigation of the Second. During the Social War, these entanglements with Mithridates lay in Sulla's future. But by the time the events we were discussing, Sulla had already captured the Numidian king Jugurtha that sealed victory for Marius in the Jugurthine War. Sulla, who came from an elite, blue-blooded patrician family, had been working his way up the ranks steadily. He had long chafed at the fawning adoration Marius received from the masses. Not only did Marius lay claim to accomplishments that had only been possible through Sulla's dash and cunning, but he also was a novus homo, a new man. Sulla had been aching to come out from underneath Marius' shadow, and the social war was his chance to do so. He began the campaign as a legate, or deputy to the senior commander, serving under the consul of 90 BCE, Lucius Julius Caesar, uncle of some guy with a similar name that you may or may not have heard of. By 89 BCE, Sulla was serving as legate to the next year's consul, Lucius Porcius Cato. This Cato was the consular colleague serving with Strabo, whose death left Strabo as the sole consul. When Cato died, killed in a battle during the Social War, Sulla assumed command of the Republican forces operating south of Rome. Finally, in full command, Sulla demonstrated a combination of tactical and strategic brilliance. Among other accomplishments, he successfully laid siege to the rebel stronghold of Pompey. Yes, that Pompey. Until this point, more of a tentative ally than part of the Roman Empire. And he won for himself the highest honor available to Roman, the grass crown, the one given to a commander whose leadership or decisive action saved an entire legion or army from obliteration at the hands of an enemy. The social war made Sulla. He easily won the consulship in 88 BCE, and likely felt that this time, his time, had finally arrived as the darling at the center of the prestige-obsessed Roman world. As we've seen in that same year, Mithridates orchestrated the mass executions of Romans throughout his kingdom, in an event we now call the Asiatic Vespers. If you are just hearing this for the first time, you really ought to go back and listen to Mithridates' episodes and have a listen. In response to this atrocity, Sulla organized an expedition to confront the Pontic king and marched east, but he almost lost his command even before he'd gotten started. Not far into his march, a political agitator back in Rome had been angling at pushing through a reform agenda. When Sulla was en route to confront Mithridates, this agitator, named Sulpicius, managed to cow the Senate into switching the command from the Mithridatic War from Sulla to that old war horse Marius, who just couldn't leave well enough alone and desperately wanted one more shot at a big command. The idea was that Marius would waltz in, take control of the army, and Sulla would be obliged to follow the law and just give way. Marius would assume command of the campaign, crush Mithridates, and cement his legacy as the greatest Roman of all time. It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see how it works out for them. When Marius' agent arrived in Sulla's camp to effect the transfer, an outraged Sulla called his men together and reminded him that if he was replaced, then the new regime would likely bring in all their own men. Without the chance to conquer Mithridates, these men would lose the chance to enrich themselves through the plunder of the decadent and luxurious Pontic kingdom. Sulla then announced his plans to turn the army around and march directly on Rome. This was a shocking proposition. Since the founding of the city, no armed troops were allowed inside the sacred boundary, the Pomerium, except in the rare triumph celebrations, which were specifically approved in advance by the Senate. Sulla's men were fired up. His officers were horrified. This was truly a dangerous precedent, and all but one of these officers, Lucullus, whom we've also met in the Mithridates episodes, refused to go along with the scheme. But Sulla had his men with him, and that's all he really needed. The troops promptly killed Marius' agent, the one who'd arrived to break the news to Sulla, and turned back for Rome. This turned out to be the opening salvo in the first large-scale civil war in Roman history, and that drama would draw out over years. This is important context because it was in this chaos that our friend Pompey began to make a name for himself. But I'm conscious that this episode has been going on for a long, long time, so we will have to suffice with a shortened version of events. Besides, we'll revisit it a little bit next week. Sulla returned home and was greeted by makeshift forces thrown together by the Marians, as well as a furious citizenry who saw Sulla's gambit as horrific. Undeterred by either, Sulla forced the Senate to convene under pain of death, made them invalidate their recent maneuvers, declared Marius and his closest conspirators enemies of the state, and dusted off his hand at a job well done. For their part, the Marians, including the great man himself, had seen Sulla's approach and fled before it. Marius and his cabal skulked off to North Africa. After organizing affairs, securing his position, and killing the agitator who'd engineered the whole transfer of power fiasco in the first place, Sulla congratulated himself on a job well done and returned to his campaign against Mithridates. He got his army east and began a series of decisive victories against the Pontic king and his Greek allies, including a thorough sacking of Athens in 86 BCE. But even as he was away and smashing the Pontic forces, events were underway in Rome that threatened to undermine him once again. It took a little while for word of these events to reach him, but when it did, there would be hell to pay. You may recall from our prior episodes that while Sulla quickly and definitively gained the upper hand in the confrontation, he concluded a hasty peace treaty in order to quickly return home and deal with what I believe I breezily described as, quote, domestic troubles, close quote. This is because once Sulla was good and far off, the Marians snuck back into Italy, gathered up a force, and began to march on Rome, themselves intent on seizing power by force. The consuls for the year 87 BCE were from very different political factions. One supported Marius, the other the existing republican government. They fell into civil war. Desperate, the Senate sent an urgent plea to Pompey Strabo, who still commanded a great army and had the resources to defend the republic against this latest existential threat. Strabo, with his young and ambitious son serving as subordinate, duly marched his army towards Rome. But rather than enter the city and defend the republic, Strabo camped outside the city and waited. Always more interested in self-enrichment than in any lofty ideology, Strabo wanted to see which side offered him the best terms to come to their side. His loyalty was to his pocketbook, not to any principles or party. But while his army camped outside one of the gates of Rome, an outbreak of dysentery swept through the ranks. The general himself caught the disease and died. Later retelling of events would say that his troops had hated him so much that they desecrated his corpse. Others tell a tale that he was killed by a lightning strike. Both of these seem unlikely, especially as the troops accepted the command of Strabo's son, Gnaeus Pompeius, or Pompey. He hadn't been called the Great yet, but it was coming, and a lot sooner than anyone could expect. As the son of Strabo, Pompey, and from here on out he's the only one we will mean when we say Pompey, inherited his father's considerable property and a significant amount of military and social prestige. But that wasn't all he inherited. At the time of his death, Strabo had been suspected of stealing public property. As he would have inherited such stolen goods, Pompey was held to account and forced to stand trial for his father's alleged embezzlement. At only 19 years of age, the young Pompey rose to the challenge and mounted a stirring defense. Some thefts he pinned on other people. Others he claimed could not be proven for lack of physical evidence. Just who was this kid, parrying all thrusts by the prosecution and looking stronger for the effort? Romans prized oratorical and legal skill, and Pompey was there, in the forum, at such a young age, the very heart of Roman civic life. He had arrived as a rising man of merit. He gained great renown for his powers of persuasion, and word spread that a new star was being born. One person so smitten with the young Pompey was none other than the presiding judge at his trial, Ansticius, at the time serving as praetor, a highly prestigious and senior magistrate second only to the consulship. So taken was Ansticius that he secretly approached the defendant and proposed a marriage between his own daughter and Pompey. Delighted, Pompey accepted. He was duly, and unsurprisingly, acquitted of all charges, and 2 days later the teenager married Antistia. In just a few weeks, Pompey put himself on the map of Roman life as a young man of skill and potential, deflected all charges against him and his late father, and scored a significant marriage alliance with another powerful Roman family. All before 20. Not a bad start at a public career out from underneath his father's shadow. Delighted by these events, the young Pompey organized a withdrawal of the army, marching them and himself back to the family's power center of Picenum. The Marians duly seized Rome, and in 86 BCE, Marius himself, by now a shell of his former self, sickly and elderly, had himself elected consul for the 7th time. Then promptly died, age 70 or 71. His towering reputation was irrevocably harmed by his desperate need to hold on to power until his dying days. His last few years were utterly pathetic, and as will be seen shortly, he didn't enjoy rest, even in death. His faction was not without capable leadership, and one of the conspirators, Cinna, had great talent and energy. He was also ruthless and violent. The Marian faction began tracking down and killing their adversaries. One after another, conservative members of Rome's ancient noble families were butchered at the hands of violent gangs orchestrated by the populist revolutionary Cinna. It was a dark time in Rome. By 83 BCE, Sulla had concluded his peace treaty with Mithridates and had landed in Italy with 5 battle-hardened veteran legions. He'd marched on Rome once. Clearly, he wouldn't hesitate to do it again. But Cinna had amassed a considerable army, one that wouldn't be so easily swept aside. The on-again, off-again civil war was about to explode in scope and violence. Many prominent Romans found their way to Sulla's camp to take up arms in the cause of the general. One of these was the young scion of a wealthy patrician family named Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus's relatives had been liquidated by the Cinnan faction, and he had a score to settle. More on this next week. Other prominent Romans resolved to stay in the city, either out of allegiance to the Cinnans or as a principled determination not to be cowed by political violence. Not everyone immediately declared their intentions. At the commencement of the next acts in this civil war, there were many unknowns, people whose allegiances could not be determined. One of these was the young Pompey, camped out in his family's home turf, surrounded by the retired veterans of his father's campaigns. Just what would he do? How would he respond to the latest crisis to royal Italy? So finally, with this long episode as context, we are finally at the point where we can shift to focus solely on Pompey and to find out why he was called the Great. And that's exactly what we're going to do in our next episode. So until then, thank you for listening to this episode. I am grateful that you did. Join us on the next one when Pompey finally takes center stage and becomes the first person we've ever known to be called the Great in their lifetime.